Welcome to NTD Business. I'm Don Ma. A number of important rulings today from the U.S. Supreme Court. It handed President Joe Biden a painful defeat on Friday, blocking his plan to cancel $430 billion in student loan debt. The justices ruled against Biden in a 6-3 decision and said that the Biden administration overstepped its authority with the plan, with conservative justices in the majority. Around 26 million U.S. borrowers applied for relief after Biden announced the plan in August last year. The court determined that the Biden administration needs Congress's endorsement before undertaking such a costly program. The majority of the justices rejected arguments that a bipartisan 2003 law dealing with student loans, also known as the HEROES Act, gave Biden the power he claimed. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote for the court, quote, 6 states sued arguing that the HEROES Act does not authorize the loan cancellation plan. We agree. And here to talk to me about this is Jenna Ellis, former senior advisor counsel to Donald Trump and constitutional attorney. So the Supreme Court rejecting Biden's student loan forgiveness plan. Now, Biden criticized Republican elected officials saying that, quote, they had no problem with billions in pandemic-related loans to businesses, and those loans were forgiven. What's your reaction?
Well, I think he's comparing apples to oranges here. And clearly what the Supreme Court held today was that he didn't have the ability to unilaterally forgive student loans. And this was not within the purview of the executive branch. And so regardless of what he would like to criticize Republicans for, that's a totally separate question. And the Supreme Court in the majority today held Biden to the rule of law, which is the U.S. Constitution. And we all need to do that as conservatives, conserving our rule of law, even if it's a Republican measure or a Democrat measure that goes outside of the specific limited authority given to that particular government actor. The Supreme Court is right to say that it's unconstitutional. So, in a nutshell, basically, the Supreme Court rejected Biden's student loan plan because he can't bypass Congress, right? Does this set a precedent for the future in cases where the executive branch wants to do something similar to get around the legislative branch? Well, it should. And I think that the Supreme Court, with a conservative majority, now is increasingly going to condemn as unconstitutional and overrule executive action that goes outside the scope of the specific limited authority that's given to the executive branch. The executive branch can't legislate. That's very clear in Article 1, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution says all legislative authority is given to Congress. All means all. And so the executive branch cannot rule by legislative fiat or by executive order.
What about the HEROES Act? Does that not give him the authority?
Well, the Supreme Court disagreed with that, and specifically in their holding, and I'm actually reading from this now, it says the Secretary of Education does not have the authority under the Higher Education Relief Opportunities for Students Act or the HEROES Act to establish a student loan forgiveness program that would cancel roughly $430 billion in debt principal and affect nearly all borrowers. So this went outside the scope of the court's reading, and I think they're absolutely correct.
Now, is this just a matter of the size of the forgiveness program? If it were smaller, let's say, I don't know, 100 million, would that make things different?
I don't think so. And I think that the issue here is, as we've been discussing, the fact that the executive branch can't go around or circumvent Congress's intent or the statutory law, and certainly not the rule of law ultimately, which is the U.S. Constitution.
All right. I also want some comments from you about the other ruling today, where a Christian web designer being allowed to refuse to work with same-sex couples. Is this unprecedented?
Well, I think this is a huge win for freedom of speech, and this is actually more of a free speech case than it is a free exercise of religion. And so the Supreme Court made a very broad opinion here saying that the state of Colorado cannot use its Anti-Discrimination Act to forcibly compel any person to speak messages that they fundamentally disagree with. And so this is balancing the interests of free speech, which are constitutionally protected under the First Amendment, against a very overbroad state-level act that violates a person's conscience. And so this is free speech protection for all. This is a great opinion. And again, 6-3 majority. This was very wide and a broad decision that upheld the U.S. Constitution.
But does this not open the door to discrimination?
Not at all. And so this is where we always have balancing interests, and freedom of speech for all means all. And so the government, through whether it's termed anti-discrimination legislation, cannot forcibly compel you or me or a website designer or anyone else to speak messages that violate our conscience or our beliefs. The government should never be able to prohibit speech, but the flip side of that coin is that the government cannot compel anyone to speak messages that violate their conscience or that they disagree with either.
But Justice Sonia Sotomayor says that this decision cannot be interpreted just solely on the basis of gender identity.
Well, I think that she's trying to make a specific argument that's really not the question here and very much outside the boundaries of what this case was about. This wasn't about discrimination against a protected class or the LGBT community. This is about upholding free speech for everyone. And so just like the First Amendment protects an LGBTQ identifying member to not affirm that they are a Christian or that they have to believe in the Bible as inerrant or sufficient. The government can't compel someone to speak those messages either. And so this is actually free speech for everyone and goes to the heart of freedom of speech, which is the right to disagree.
Does this decision infringe on the rights of the LGBTQ people?
Not at all. And that's exactly what the Supreme Court majority held, which is, again, that free speech is for everyone. And so just like the government couldn't compel me to go and speak messages in the political sphere that I disagree with and say that I think Biden is doing a great job, or force me to write a speech for him, or force me to speak messages that I disagree with, the government cannot compel anyone, whether they are a member of the LGBT community, a Christian, or have any other worldview, to speak messages that they disagree with. And that is the heart of freedom of speech that the First Amendment is designed to preserve and protect.
All right, let me just get one more comment from you. A number of rulings this week all seem to lean conservative. Many Democrats and progressives are accusing the court of being politicized. What's your response to that?
Well, it's interesting that when the Supreme Court issues a ruling that Democrats disagree with, their automatic reaction is to simply say, well, we need to pack the court or we need to change the rules. And Republicans, unfortunately, sometimes do the same thing, but it's most often the Democrats. What people need to realize is that the court right now has a majority of conservatives and originalists. That means that we're actually applying the rule of law to everyone, regardless of whether it's a Republican proposition or a Democrat proposition. Every single person in the United States should respect the fact that we are under a rule of law. We are a nation of rules, not rulers. And so we need to protect and preserve our U.S. Constitution as the supreme rule of law. And so this isn't a matter of being politicized. This is a matter of making sure that we are upholding our rule of law in this country for everyone.
All right. Thank you so much today, Jenna. It was great speaking with you.
Great to speak with you, too. Thanks.
And just a quick update on inflation. An index that is closely monitored by the Federal Reserve tumbled last month to its lowest level since April 2021. It's being pulled down by lower gas prices and lower rising food costs. The Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index shows inflation is now at 3.8% compared to the same time last year. And moving on, Mexico began imposing a 50% tariff on white corn imports earlier this week. It's a move the president says looks to boost national production and prevent imports of genetically modified corn. Mexico imports some white corn, the kind that is used for human consumption, mainly from the United States and South Africa. But since the tariff goes against the U.S. Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement, it could complicate the trade dispute that the country already has with the U.S. and Canada as well over GM corn. The U.S. and Canada say that this would harm trade in the region. Mexico has been importing GM feed corn from the U.S. for years. And at the same time, a prolonged shortage of a certain red sauce is causing costs to skyrocket. Prices of sriracha sauce are as high as $70 on eBay as people look to snap up the spicy sauce. And they're even steeper on Amazon, up to $124. Hoi Fong Foods, which makes the rooster-adorned bottle sauce, has been dealing with a years-long shortage of the chilies. There's been a shortage for the past 3 years, and Hoi Fong has said that its chili peppers have consistently been in short supply. Joining me now is the CEO of the U.S. Hispanic Business Council, Javier Palomares. Now, what I wanted to talk to you about is recently Mexico wanted to restrict GM white corn for human consumption and possibly eventually also veto GM yellow corn for animal feed, and as well as slapping a 50% tariff on white corn imports. So now Mexico imports about $3 to $5 billion worth of U.S. corn, the vast majority being GM yellow corn. My question to you is this going to hurt the U.S. in terms of trade?
Undoubtedly, it will. A tariff could mean that corn production will be disincentivized in the United States, and that ultimately could create food inflation within our own country, which obviously would hurt the American family, the American economy. Keep in mind, Don, that America consumes some $73 billion of corn a year. But only about 10% of that is used in the form of food. The other 90% is used in a variety of products from ethanol to livestock feed to soap and even batteries. And so disincentivizing the production of corn will mean a smaller crop. The prices for the available corn will undoubtedly go up, and that will impact a variety of industries within the American economy.
Yeah, maybe you can name some of the impacts of these industries.
Well, again, if you look at where corn is actually used, 90% of it is used in non-food production. Cornstarch, by way of example, is used to conduct electricity in the manufacturing of batteries. Cornstarch is used in the manufacturing of cosmetics. And obviously, corn is used as livestock feed for, all of the animals in the agricultural sector. So the impacts could be quite broad within the American economy.
And and Mexico, is that a major partner for the U.S. when it comes to corn trade?
Absolutely. It is number one, number two, or number three, depending on which state you're looking at. But Mexico will rank either first, second, or third trading partner to almost 39 American states. So the impact could be very serious to the American economy.
I mean, does this violate the U.S. Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement?
Well, I won't get into whether it violates the trade agreement. It certainly isn't a move that is welcomed by the agricultural sector, I can tell you that. But I think it points to, a broader issue within the American society, if you will. Unfortunately, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about how volatile and insecure our food production is in the United States. And things like this, you whether you have a drought, which is an act of God, you have a foreign government, impacting us through tariffs and things of this nature. These are things that are outside of our control, and they ultimately will impact, obviously, production in the United States and therefore impact the American family. But there are things that we could do to help our agricultural sector. By way of example, and I talk about this constantly, immigration reform could be something that we can control. It is a step that we could take to offer some relief for our farmers, our ranchers, our meat producers, our dairy producers, et cetera. Keep in mind, 73% of agricultural workers in the United States are foreign-born. They're immigrants. And so this is the largest cost, if you will, embedded within the industry, whether you're talking to strawberry growers in California, citrus growers in Florida, meat packing and poultry packing operations in the Sun Belt, or dairy farmers in the Midwest. It doesn't matter. They all have one thing in common, and that is a challenge when it comes to labor. And so there are things that we can control, and that's where we look to our elected officials. This is where we look to our administration, we look to our Congress and Senate, and ask them for relief. I am encouraged by something called the Dignity Act. The Dignity Act is a bill that's being proposed by Democrat Veronica Escobar from Texas and Republican Elvira Salazar from Florida. It proposes redoing our immigration reform system. It proposes modernizing our H-2A and H-2B visa programs, and it even creates a whole new set of visas specifically tailored for the agricultural sector. These are the things that we can control. Again, we can't control a drought. That's an act of God. We can't control a tariff from a foreign government. These things obviously impact our industries, but there are things we could be doing to take control of that industry. There are the things that we can do, like immigration reform, that ultimately, I think, offer some relief for our agricultural sector. That's the kind of creative, collaborative, and courageous leadership that we expect from our elected officials. So I think the Dignity Act points to something that is within our control. It is something we could do. And I propose that the American people should be aware of it and should back it, because it is a step in the right direction in offering support for our farmers and our ranchers and the agricultural sector in general.
Right, and I do want to follow up on this topic of immigration a bit later, but first, I think what this all comes down to is the impact on the individual, on families, right? And you mentioned that a bit earlier, so I want to ask you, what exactly is the impact on families?
Well, if you talk about the drought that's happening right now and the impact it has on peppers, one would not think, right? But when you connect these dots, when you have a drought that impacts pepper production, the number one selling condiment in American cuisine is hot sauce. It's surpassed ketchup long ago. And so as the supply of peppers is diminished because of a drought, the cost of the peppers goes up, the cost of creating the sauce goes up, and ultimately the American family, which consumes 75% of Americans on a daily basis, consume hot sauce. And so ultimately the American family pays for something like that. When you look at a foreign government imposing a tariff on our exports of corn, again, it means that corn producers will be disincentivized. There will be less corn produced. The price of the available corn will go up. And as that price of the available corn goes up, ultimately the American family gets impacted. Again, only 10% of our corn production goes into food, but the other 90% is consumed by the American family in the form of batteries, cosmetics, in the agricultural sector to feed the animals that are part of the agricultural sector. So all of these things are interconnected. I think as a society, as a nation, we should focus on the things that we can control and try to help our agricultural sector as best we can.
All right, let me just ask one more question on the corn tariffs, and then I'll move on to the drought. Mexico has to think about its own economy. I wonder, why is it doing this, if you can comment on that?
It's beyond me as to why Mexico has taken this step. It doesn't make a ton of sense to me. As I mentioned earlier, Mexico is the either number one, number two, or number three export market for 39 of our American states. And so it has a wonderful partner in America. The only thing I can think of is that they're trying to, somehow bolster their own economy by charging us more for our exports. But the reality of it is, this could ultimately end up, hurting them as much as it hurts us. I think we should do everything that we can to talk to the Mexican government and see if there's a way forward. But an imposition of a tax simply because they can, I think is short-sighted. I think it's ill-conceived, and there are, I think downstream, there are impacts that they haven't thought through. So I'm hopeful that we can work through this and figure out a way that we can continue to produce the crops that we need here in the United States and continue to have a willing buying partner in Mexico.
Okay, now about the apparent Mexican chili pepper shortage due to droughts. This is already affecting prices. For example, sriracha sauce going through the roof now. But I would imagine the impacts go beyond that, right?
Yeah, it does. Again, as I mentioned, hot sauce is now the #1 selling condiment in American cuisine. Some 75% of Americans consume hot sauce or salsa on a daily basis. So ultimately, the American family gets impacted. The American table gets impacted as these costs go up. Additionally, further down the road, we will see less and less availability of the hot sauces, and what is available will cost even more than it does now. And so, this is again something that we can't control. A drought is an act of God. There's very little we can do about that. But there are areas where we can help our agricultural sector. And as I mentioned earlier, immigration reform would be a wonderful thing that our Congress could enact and start to modernize our visa and guest worker programs to offer some relief to our members of the agricultural industry. And in doing so, at least help with that cost. That again is something that's controllable. It's within our ability to do something about that. And I'm hopeful that things like the Dignity Act, which is being proposed by a Democrat in Texas, Veronica Escobar, and a Republican in Florida, Elvira Salazar, I'm hopeful that the Dignity Act will pass because it will finally offer some support for our members of the agricultural sector by modernizing the guest worker program and even creating a brand new set of visas specifically tailored for agricultural workers.
Now, on the topic of immigration reform, I would imagine it would have a positive impact beyond the agricultural sector as well. For example, it would decrease the amount of illegal immigrants coming into the U.S.?
Absolutely. I think what I'm seeing right now in the administration, I'm enthusiastic about that. As I mentioned, the Dignity Act is a step in the right direction by really creating a modernized visa system. But I'm also seeing, a focus from, the administration to target and find those that we know are here to do us damage, to harm the American people, and focusing on those that we know have a record, that we know have been involved in crime, and finding them and very quickly, deporting them. This is the kind of focus that I think we need from the administration. I applaud the recent moves by President Biden and the administration in doing so, because what that then allows is for us to take what are limited resources, really, if you think about a country of our size, take those resources and focus on those that we know are here illegally and are apt to do us harm. This allows then for us to work with the immigrants that are here to help, to contribute, and somehow figuring out a way to put them to work. Because I mentioned earlier, if you look at the agricultural sector, whether that's dairy farmers in the Midwest, strawberry growers in California, or citrus growers in Florida, it's all over the agricultural sector. Labor is the #1 challenge that they have right now. And we need, as a society, the administration, our Congress, needs to come together and find ways to offer support to those in the agricultural sector. And one way they could do that is through immigration reform.
I think both politicians from the left and right agree that the U.S. needs more human capital. But on that point, thank you so much today for speaking with me, Javier.
Thanks for having me, Don. Have a great weekend.
You as well.